Welcome to episode 11 of the Die Human podcast. Today, I have the great pleasure of being joined by Dr. Andrew Abela. Dr. Abela is the founding dean of the Busch School of Business and professor of marketing at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. His widely cited research on marketing, communication, and integrity has been published in several academic journals and 2 books. He is a sought-after speaker on business ethics and cultivating the super habits of success in organizations. Prior to his academic career, Dr. Abela was a brand manager at Procter & Gamble, management consultant with McKinsey & Company, and managing director at the Corporate Executive Board. He holds an MBA from the Institute for Management Development in Switzerland and a PhD from the Darden Business School at the University of Virginia. He and his wife, Kathleen, live in Great Falls, Virginia, and have been blessed with 6 children and 2 grandchildren. All right, so
Yep.
updated. Congratulations, and thank you so much for being here with me.
My pleasure.
Well, today at Mass, fortuitously, the first reading was from the book of Ezekiel. And I would like to just start off with this reading, if I may, just the first part of it anyway. Thus says the Lord God, if the wicked man turns away from all the sins he committed, if he keeps all my statutes and does what is right and just, he shall surely live. He shall not die. None of the crimes he committed shall be remembered against him. He shall live because of the virtue he has practiced. And that's how, on this day that we're having this conversation, the first reading began. And you've written this incredible book, Superhabits, which is all about the practice and the cultivation of virtue in one's life. And I was so struck by that, not just by that virtue, through virtue we live as a coffin maker. So my business is called Marion Caskets, and I started in 2009. I've been building caskets. I started in Washington State, and I'm in Scranton, Pennsylvania now because we're next door. We're called by God really to this place, and next door to us is a crisis pregnancy center and maternity home that we're helping build at the same time that we're working our business here and supporting them.
Wow. Okay.
And that's the whole story of how that came about. But so in the course of my work, I have built hundreds of caskets and had thousands of conversations with people, and I've seen good deaths and bad deaths, and I've seen just how much a good life and an intentionally good life, not necessarily from the time somebody was born until they died at 85, but just a choice along the way to live a virtuous life has made in their deaths, according to their families, even people who I've talked to who are dying, who are at peace with it, versus people who are terrified. I've built caskets for lots of people who've taken their own lives. And to see that, and to see that there's this way we could choose to live. There's this formula. I mean, and I don't want to denigrate the mystery that is a human life, but there are practical steps we can take for a good life, and they're not being taught. They're not being taught. I grew up in the 80s, and it was ethics and values, and it wasn't until, and I heard about something being virtuous, whatever, but to be taught the virtues, I didn't encounter that idea until I met a woman who was a graduate of Thomas Aquinas College in the 1990s at a place called Madonna House in Ontario, and it opened my eyes to just how important and how neglected the practice of virtues are in the modern world. So thank you. And thank you for writing this book, which is incredible. And I'd love to talk to you about it here this afternoon.
Delighted. And it's funny because I also met a girl who was a graduate of Thomas Aquinas College, and I married her. And we've
Good.
been married for 27 years. So
Oh,
yeah,
congratulations. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I didn't marry that girl, but I was better prepared to marry the woman I did, who I've been married to
that's
for
good.
25 years.
All right.
Yeah.
Congratulations. Good.
Yeah.
Um,
So have you thought much when you're writing this book? Well, I can't imagine how much work this book must have taken because it is so comprehensive, it is so thorough, it is so readable in the way that you identify the virtues, classical virtues through Thomas Aquinas largely, and then map them and then embed them in these wonderful stories and that are so readable in this book. So along the way, since I'm a coffin maker, how present was the idea of the end of life when you were thinking about a good life?
Probably not enough. especially since I am on the verge of turning 60. It should be more
I'm
apparent.
just right behind you.
Okay. The but what is interesting, both kind of in my own life and in the lives of the people I wrote about in the book, many of them lived a long time ago. So many of the people I've written about are dead, and so it's interesting to look at their lives versus the lives of my students, say, who are just sort of starting out on adulthood. And um, that perspective, the perspective from the end of your life just changes everything, doesn't it? It just puts
Yes.
everything into perspective. The things we worry about, relatively speaking, are so small. Things we don't worry about, like virtue, can be really big, um, yeah, but it's not very explicit in the book. But I say it does crop up. So, for example, you'll recall the chapter on practical wisdom where I wrote about Captain Sullenberger and the heroic crash landing on the Hudson River. Shortly after I wrote the book, I don't forget exactly how, but somehow on LinkedIn, I was connected to one of the survivors from that plane crash.
Hmm.
And so I reached out to him and I sent him the chapter and asked him if he would read it and tell me if there
Oh,
were any errors, just let me know, was it realistic? And he said it was entirely as he remembered it, which was I was happy to hear. And then we had a Zoom conversation, and I asked him what was, if any, was the sort of lasting effect of that experience. And he said, having come so close to death, even though it's now 16 years, he said he still lives every day with gratitude.
whoa.
So that was very moving, I thought. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you're talking to your students and you're very focused on the virtues, how are you finding them at the beginning of their lives? Like you say, they don't have that perspective to say, like, oh, all these actions that I could have taken or not taken are adding up to someplace, to something that I'm becoming, to someplace that I'm going. You can't kind of front load that as much as we want to as parents and as teachers and things. But are you finding that the way that you're presenting these is resonating with your students?
Yes, because the first thing I try to do, and I think this is just really important to anyone who's listening to this, is explain that the word virtue is so badly misunderstood by so many people. In the very worst case, they think of it in terms of virtue signaling.
Yeah.
Look how good I am, And then who wants that, But even people who have read about virtue and studied virtue and try to be virtuous, they they think of the word more as an exhortation, It's like courage. Okay, I should be courageous.
Hmm.
But there's little understanding of exactly how. And the good news when you understand that really when we say the word virtue and we talk about virtue, the traditional idea of a virtue is a habit, right? A good habit that anyone can acquire through daily practice.
Yes.
So, if you think, well, I'm not a very courageous person, I would never want to admit that to anyone because who would want to admit that they're not courageous? Where do I go to get courage? Like I try to be courageous, but what does that mean? When something terrible happens and I don't feel courageous. So how am I supposed to be courageous? Um, and the idea is that the two things. One is that you find some small practice that you can do every day that builds up your courage. Sometimes it's really almost silly sounding. One that I found on YouTube was, which I mentioned in the book. A guy recommends for I think it's 60 days, each day, once a day, go ask somebody for something where you know you're going to be refused. No one likes that. Nobody wants to do that. And the first time you do it, it's like, oh, I feel so stupid, But the first time is always going to be the hardest the hardest experience. Then the second one is going to be less hard, and the third. And the amazing thing is, as you go through an exercise like that, you are actually growing in courage.
So interesting. It's actually a form of exposure therapy, where they talk about in cognitive behavioral therapy. You've got to face your fears, and we think of those for like post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety disorders because those are acute fears. But we actually all have these kind of passive, for lack of a better word, fears that are interfering with us moving forward in life. So instead of waiting for like the big fear to come out, kind of attack the smaller fears and then grow in that courage along the way. That's great.
Exactly, exactly. And it's um, actually, I'm glad you brought up cognitive behavioral therapy because I was chatting with a um, uh, and somebody was doing advanced study in psychology at one of the Harvard medical schools, one of the hospitals affiliated with Harvard Medical School, and he said, and we were talking about the virtue of resilience, which according to Aquinas is kind of one of the allied virtues to courage. And it's specifically for dealing with mental pain. So anxiety, depression, and so on. It's the ability to move forward despite the feelings of anxiety, etc. And he said the best treatment for anxiety and for depression, which is like the most, because there are many iterations, have been many iterations of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? It keeps evolving, improving. The very latest are almost indistinguishable from cultivating the virtue of resilience. So 750 years after St. Thomas Aquinas, so yeah.
Incredible, incredible. Yeah, and you talk about like wrestling with virtue because I had that conversation in 1997 that I told you about at Madonna House, and I I thought about it, like it stuck with me the way she said it. This I had said like, yeah, I don't know, because I was coming out of kind of a dissolute young adulthood and childhood, and I I actually had this strong conversion experience there. I was like, how could I have been so blind? And she said, well, it's because they stopped teaching the virtues. They stopped teaching virtue. And like it was such a succinct answer. I had like this very mysterious, foggy feeling of just sober inebriation and gratitude and all these things that she had like this kind of almost formulaic, well, here's the reason. No, it's not like that. Again, the mystery of the human person that you simply put something in front of somebody and they take it in and they go, oh, this is the formula for a happy life. But the fact that she was just so confident about that being at least a part of why I was confused for so long. And then I took that and I was like, it just, what does that mean? And over time, well, then I got married soon thereafter and I started having children and I had 8 children and distractions came in. And sometimes I would think, well, I wish I would behave better, and virtue would cross my mind. How do I teach virtue? And I would pick up some books along the way, like this one and this one and
Yeah.
this one and this one and this one
Okay.
and this one. And then there were other ones like William Bennett's book on virtue.
Yeah.
And I took a train cross country. And a friend of mine gave me a copy of Nicomachean Ethics. This is right before I met my wife and got married. And I left it on the floor of his car. And I spent 3 days on a train with nothing to read, sitting in the seat. But maybe if I would have taken that book, I would be a
Oh,
PhD in virtue ethics right now or something like that. That didn't happen. But to your point of how we know about this word, we know about this concept, and even with these really excellent books that are out there and things, to try to take it from the well, from Aristotle to Thomas Aquinas to modern scholars and really make it understandable. I was actively trying, and yeah, there's smarter people than me who could do a better job, but it wasn't until your book, which came along, crossed my radar just recently because it's a new book. Um, and frankly, the way you charted it, as we have here in our framed copy. So I was saying to
nice.
my wife, what happened to our Anatomy of Virtue? Where's the Anatomy of Virtue? She's like, oh, I don't know. But she was actually having it framed quietly on
Oh,
the side
nice.
for me. So,
That's
yeah.
terrific.
So you've done this incredible job of really mapping this out, and you have the virtues, and then they're not sub virtues, but they're component parts, like you were talking about with courage, where you
Yeah.
take a piece of this and you can actually exercise this and move forward as opposed to just having kind of an amorphous concept that I should be better. I ought to be better. Oh, I got in a tough situation and I was more cowardly. But to build a life every day, this life that God has given us, and to try to take it and actually, be what He created us to be in a muddled world, that's really hard. But with the wisdom of the ancients and then distilled in what you've done here. It's a practical, there's practical exercises. So I don't know how to go ahead. Sorry.
No, the practicality is the point, I think. You can admire virtue from afar, but until you make it your own, it doesn't help, you know. I mean, I suppose it's helpful to aspire to be virtuous, but you're still missing the point at that point. Um the the idea the reason I wrote the book is we had started experimenting with different approaches to form our students in virtue at the Busch School where I teach at Catholic University, and started to see how effective they can be. And I thought I need to get this to a wider audience to make the point that virtue is, it's a habit that anyone can acquire that makes your life more effective, happier, healthier, and easier. Like, which part of that don't you want? Do you know what I mean? It's like, why aren't people just rampaging, to find this and do this? And I think it's a number of reasons. I think one is, as I mentioned before, the word virtue itself is a turnoff to so many
Hmm.
people, unfortunately. They think of it as sort of goody two shoes, or just, excessively moralistic or whatever. So that's one problem. Another problem. So you waved those books pretty fast, but I recognized Donald DeMarco's book. I recognize Peter Kreeft's book. I mean, these are all really good books about virtue. The problem is every one of them has a slightly or dramatically different list of virtues, as you probably noticed,
Hmm.
right? So it's
Yeah.
like, wait, if these darn things are so important, why can't we agree on which ones? Is it every positive abstract noun is a virtue, in which case there could be hundreds, maybe thousands, Um, and so I was scratching my head and looking to see if there could be any kind of definitive list. And then a friend of mine, my one-time co-author, Joe Capizzi, who is now the dean of the School of Theology at Catholic U. When we were both junior professors, we collaborated on something called the Catechism for Business, which was a collection of church teaching about business and economics. And so I knew Joe was a good theologian, and my background is business and ethics, not theology. So I said to him, Joe, I'm looking, has anybody ever done any kind of taxonomy on the
Yeah.
virtues? In the same way we have a taxonomy of the elements, the periodic table of the elements. You
Yeah.
remember from high school. Because imagine if, like, would we consider acceptable if every book about chemistry had a different periodic table? Which is like, that's crazy. Like, how could we be understanding the world around us if we can't even agree? One guy has iron but not sodium, the other one has sodium but not, you know what I'm saying?
I had enough
Um,
trouble with chemistry without that.
right, at least. So I asked him, and he said, "Well, check Father Romanus Cesario. He's a great Dominican theologian, and he had a book called Virtue or the Examined Life. Great book. And what it is a kind of a summary and elaboration of St. Thomas's treatise on the virtues. And I had read bits of St. Thomas's treatise on the virtues, but it's a little overwhelming. It's a big thing. And but with the guidance of reading Father Cesario's book, I was able to then go back to the treatise and go through it much more carefully, question by question, article by article. And I had this sort of aha moment when I realized that Aquinas, unlike everybody else before or since, wasn't just enumerating, kind of listing the virtues. He was showing how they all fit together in a
Mm.
system. And so then from there, I kept playing with ways of diagramming it and ended up with the picture which you have so nicely framed, which shows that because what he was doing was creating a framework, and the way he was doing that, as you know, I go through this in length in the book in terms of how he was doing it. But basically, he does it by drawing finer and finer distinctions in a human life. And by doing that, every time he makes a distinction, there's no overlap and no gap within the things that he's distinguishing. And what that means, most people are saying, well, so what, who cares? What it means is that he covers every aspect of one's life with just 50 virtues, 50. May seem like a lot, but everything, every possible situation in life, everything you might struggle with, there's a virtue for that. We can know that for sure. And we can know that the 50 that he came up with are a complete set. Now, you might want to invent others, but they'll usually be part of one of
Yes.
those 50, you know? So it's very reassuring because it says, okay, this picture is a map of the rest of my life. Like if I want to develop myself, this is it, you know?
Yeah, and that no overlap, no gap, that's so much more satisfying. Like you're saying, with if it was a changing periodic table or a changing taxonomy, but just you as you read your book and as you go deeper into, looking and trying, it's a lot. I'll hold it up again. It's a lot at first anyway. Like it starts to clarify more and more the more time you spend with the book and the more time you spend looking at this anatomy taxonomy that you've illustrated here. Um, but the the fact that it is so comprehensive, a lot of times in self, and I know you talk about how you call it super habits as opposed to virtues, something virtue, because you're kind of embedding it in the self-help genre, but then surprise, it's ancient wisdom in a digestible, understandable, story-based format. So which is wonderful. Um, but that when you when you sorry, what was I going to say? Got so excited about your digestible, uh, the way that this is written, um, that you had. I don't even remember what I was going to say. It was so comprehensive. Anyway, it's just very satisfying to take that to so you map that out. It's kind of like a body in some ways. I mean, you take the skeleton and you like have this anatomy, and then you put like I guess like what I was thinking about before this was you frequently. I mean, there's almost a fear that like a systematic theologian like Thomas Aquinas is almost taking some of the the wonder out of existence because he is such a precise thinker as far as what makes us human, what a human being is, and our relationship to God. It almost feels like it's in opposition to mysticism in some ways. But by taking this and creating such a kind of skeletal structure, I mean, what Thomas Aquinas does, what you do, and then put it in the story, it actually gives you the freedom to allow the mystery to be a part of your life without it being fearsome because
Yes.
there's a solid skeleton that the mystery is on top of in some ways. I don't
No,
know
you're
how.
exactly right. So you don't want to make real what is properly mysterious, like because then you're going to dumb it down, right? But you don't want to make mysterious what is knowable and real, because then you're losing an opportunity to grow and to learn,
Right.
and so on. And so what I love about Aquinas is he's just so clear in kind of laying out what we can know, what we do know, and just make it very, very practical.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what I was thinking about with the kind of self-help genre is that you take this and you put it into that sort of language so that it does feel approachable, but then it is such an entry into wonder at the same time that it is very clear in that way. Um, you mentioned the signs that are behind me. So this is actually how I learned about you and your work was I posted something on Facebook at the end of last year saying that 2025 should be the year of virtue. I've just been frustrated, like I talk about, to see people having sad sad ends to their lives, feeling like this gift that they've been given for whatever reason, it's all trusting in God's mercy, has fallen short or even way short, tragically short of what it could be. And so I was thinking about 2025 as the year of mercy because I've just been think or of the year of virtue because I've been thinking about virtue for a couple of years. That's the first time I made these signs behind me was the fall of 2022. And I was just like, how could I practically get virtue across to my family and to other people. So you pointed out that the term virtue signals is not a great term to associate with virtue, but I'm trying to reclaim it. So I call these virtue signals. So they're signs about virtue.
Oh, nice.
So
Okay.
so I went through and I did one for each day of the week. Actually, I had it with a sign that says in the world but not of it. And then underneath it, you hang a different
Oh, I see.
virtue for each day of
Okay.
the week with the first the four cardinal virtues and then the three theological virtues. And I wanted to do that so that my children could so we could focus on a virtue a day. Like, let's just think about this today. Let's think about this the way we interact. And I mapped them out the way I did before reading your book: prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. Because prudence seems to me that it's kind of like a dashboard. You're kind of looking at where you are, where you're going. And so start the week with that.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And then justice, okay, get out of yourself and think about others. What is due to the other people in your life? So that was Tuesday. And then Wednesday, I went with temperance because classically, a lot of times people will fast on Wednesdays in Catholicism. It's a
Good.
day.
Yeah.
So it makes sense. Okay, this is a day of self-restraint. So temperance. And then Thursday, I went with fortitude because it was left for one reason, but also because I thought it kind of unfolded to show right before we get into the theological virtues that you need courage. And all of these things, I think you find yourself falling a little bit short, a little bit short, a little bit short. And then you go into the weekend with with the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, which are infused virtues, right? As your chart shows. These are not, we would say they're not practical virtues and you don't work on them. These are from God, right?
Yep.
The
Given to you.
theological
Yeah.
virtues. Um, but I wanted that to just be something that we could do in our family so that we could exercise, so that we wouldn't meet somebody, wait till we were in our 20s in 19 or in 2050 or whenever my kids will be in their 20s and have to run into somebody who thankfully tells them that there's such a thing in the world as virtue. So when you talk, do you actually teach a class? I mean, or do you bring it into all your classes as do you kind of sprinkle throughout on virtues?
Both. So I teach a graduate class that is just on this.
Wow.
And Superhabits is the textbook, and we do in-class exercises, and the students have homework and so on to practice. But then we also try to incorporate it into other classes as well. So, for example, in a finance class, the professor gives the students opportunities to grow in temperance or self-discipline uh, by playing an investing game, like doing mock kind of investments, because one of the surest way to lose money on the stock market is to let your emotions run away with
Mm-hmm.
you.
Mm-hmm.
And so growing in temperance, growing in self-discipline is a really good way to prepare for being an investor, but it's also a really good way to prepare for life, right? So,
Yeah.
so we do those kinds of things. And we try to integrate it into different parts of class. And then just this last summer, by the grace of God, we won $1 million grant to take those kinds of exercises and put them across the entire university at Catholic
Oh,
universities.
wow.
Yeah, so
That
we'll
is
be working
wonderful.
on that. We're preparing for that now, and we'll be launching that next fall. Um,
And
so yeah,
and for those of us who are not at Catholic University, you've also created an app that goes with this to help people on the path of virtue in their own lives.
yeah. So the current instance is called Grow Virtue, um, and it's available in the Apple App Store, not yet on Android. We're working on that. And the app does two things. One is it's a diagnostic. So it asks you a bunch of questions, and then it will kind of give you rate you on. There's a free version of the app and a paid version. The free version will tell you which are your five strongest virtues and the five that most need work. And the paid version will list all 40 some of them. It's not, we don't have all 50 in the app, but we have most of them. And so that's the first thing it does is it gives you a diagnosis. And then the second thing it does is it helps you choose specific practices, like the asking a question where you
Yeah.
know the answer, but often much simpler practices than that, and then gives you daily reminders to practice so that you're growing that virtue. And where we're heading with it, this is still in development, is we want to create a team dashboard that you can use in any organization, either for the whole company or for the leadership team, for a group of people, where it will take the average of everybody's how everybody does on the diagnostic without, so we're not going to reveal anybody's
Right.
private information to anybody else, but it'll take an average across the whole group. And then you can see, okay, collectively as a group, what's our biggest weakness? And let's focus on that together and give each other encouragement and so on, and practice together and give feedback. Because when people work together and live together, they tend to have common virtues and common vices,
Hmm.
because virtue and vices both spread by observing others, and by being, and there's research that confirms this. And so the idea is, let's find the biggest kind of weakness. And then that's when it gets really, really practical, because we were talking about this a little bit earlier on. When we talk about virtue, people think it's just about ethics. It's just about being good in a moral sense.
Right.
It isn't just that, as important as that is. It's also about being good, as in being effective, being successful, which is why I picked the word success for the subtitle, Universal System
Hmm.
for a Successful Life. And people say, well, what do you mean by success? Well, I mean, in the greatest sense of the word, a happy, flourishing life and a happy death, right? That's true success. Um, but even living the life, a virtuous life, doesn't guarantee that you're going to be financially successful, but it makes it much more likely than if you're not, because if you are, so you've got the cardinal virtues, right? Each one of them. So prudence, I call practical wisdom, another word for prudence, because we said this about virtue, but it's so true about many of the names of virtue, that they've kind of lost their meaning.
Yes, prudence for sure.
Prudence, right? Sounds like, oh, be prudent, be, yeah. So practical wisdom is the habit of making wise decisions. Well, someone who makes wise decisions is likely going to be more financially successful than someone
Mm.
who doesn't, or just successful in every measure. Or justice, the habit of treating others fairly, is going to be have a happier and more successful life, because if you treat people well, they treat you well back. And
Yeah.
and same for, especially for fortitude or courage, the habit of moving forward even though you might be afraid. You're going to be less likely to be run over by obstacles. And
Mm.
then, of course, especially temperance, which I call self-discipline, again, because temperance makes people think of the ladies' temperance movement, of the 1920s. Um, and it's the habit of only following your desires when it's rational to do so, when it makes sense to do so. And there's so much depth to each of those
There
definitions.
is.
But I do want to riff off. You were talking about the sequence you take them in the week, which I really like. I think it makes so much sense. I have a different sequence in the book, because you're right that prudence comes first. It's kind of the greatest of the four cardinal virtues. Certainly, the charioteer of the virtues is called,
Right.
right? But and so in the order of the kind of what's more important, prudence. But in the order of how do you develop them, you flip it. And you start
Hmm.
with self-discipline, because if you have
Hmm.
no self-discipline, your life is just going to be you prey to whatever impulse you have. So I wrote the book in the order of development. That's why it
Yeah.
starts with restraint as the very first, right? So yeah.
Yeah. And since it isn't, I didn't write this as a lifelong, do this for 5 years, then 10 years. The idea is you're repeating it every week. And one of the things that I get out of the way I'm trying to do it and teach my kids is, well, we're kind of, as far as prudence, well, we don't really know exactly where we are or exactly where we're going right now. And as far as justice, wow, I fail at that again and again. So then we hit Wednesday with temperance, and it's like, oh, I really need to work on this. So in some ways, it's almost a primer for your order, because it's like, oh, I've fallen short. I don't have the wisdom, and I don't have the generosity or the strength. So now maybe if I do discipline myself, we're in Lent right now, and it's a time of fasting. And I talked to our mutual friends, Jay Richards, about his wonderful book, Eat, Fast, Feast.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
because it really, so in my own life, it was when I started to take self-discipline seriously that that I actually started to have more wisdom, like the prudence. I started to see things more clearly for what they were. So I think your order is right. And maybe when I carve the next set, I'll change it around, but maybe it works from a day to day this way also.
Well, I'll make a suggestion, because you're right. As you grow in any one virtue, all the others get lifted up as well, because it's such a unity. The system is so unified. I would suggest that you do one extra thing in addition to your daily focus. Pick one of the allied virtues, the smaller ones,
Yes.
probably from self-discipline, and just do that every day, the whole family together, every day for a month, 3 months, until, because you want your kids, and for yourself too. I want this for our students, for my kids, for myself, to have the experience of going from something where you think it's not a strength for you
Mm.
to So it's become a strength merely through daily practice. I'll give you an example. My wife used to think she was not creative at all. She just, that's how she would label us. I'm not a creative person.
Hmm.
I don't have lots of ideas. I'm not one of those people, you know. Now I'm a like mile a minute, idea a minute kind of guy. So, so, but just being together and with me encouraging her and her thinking about it, you know, she's become really creative. Now she's coming up with all kinds of ideas, you know, and so it's such a great example. And so if there's something that your kids are afraid of or label themselves as I'm not good at that, or I'm
Hmm.
not good at persevering, I'm not, you know, just pick on that and just do a little exercise every day. And different people can have different exercises, but if you're all working on the same thing, then you can kind of celebrate together as you grow. Because that's the thing that I want people to realize about the virtues is that they are these muscles, right, that we have. We have them all, but we need to exercise
Yeah.
them to really strengthen them. And so find your weakest muscle and just keep exercising that. And then you realize, wow, that got strong. Let me try another one now, you know?
That opens up so many horizons because there are so many people telling us, well, just work with your strengths and other, there's other people who can do the things that you can't do well. So everybody has their
I
strengths and
hate that.
weaknesses. Yeah.
I hate that.
It doesn't
It's
make
so
life the
wrong.
adventure it should be, really.
Yeah, yeah. It's also, but I think there's a huge confusion here, even among the smartest researchers. And I hope at some point to be able to plumb the depths and get somebody to kind of complete this research. But the confusion, I think, is between character and personality. People
Okay.
use these almost interchangeably.
Hmm.
Whereas personality are those parts of you, particularly driven by preferences, that are largely unchanging. Or if they change over years or decades.
Hmm.
Things like your preference, you know, for introversion or extroversion. Are you energized by being with people or energized by being alone? If you're energized by quiet time, I suppose you could struggle to try to become energized by being with people, you know, but that's it's more kind of defining you are who you are.
Hmm.
Whereas your character are the virtues, which are eminently changeable, right? Because they are habits can be developed. And so if I'm an introvert, I can say, well, I'm just an introvert. That's the way I am. And that is true. And so I probably don't want to choose a career where I'm constantly having to be with people because I would be exhausted at the end of
Yeah.
every day, you know? Likewise, if I am extroverted and I get energy from being people, I probably don't want a career where I'm going to be in an office writing by myself for much of the day because I go stir crazy. So those are good things to know and good to kind of play to your strengths when we're talking about personality. But when we're talking about character, we're talking about virtues, then you want to find your biggest weakness because that
Hmm.
biggest weakness is the weakest link in your character.
Oh,
And you want to fix that because that's the weakest link is always where the chain breaks, right? And the spiritual masters will always say, kind of find your biggest spiritual weakness because that's where the devil
oh, yeah,
comes
yeah.
in. Saint Ignatius of Loyola has this beautiful vision of your soul is like a citadel, you know, and the devil is the enemy
Hmm.
general who's kind of prodding to figure out where's the weakest point
Hmm.
in the citadel, and then I'm going to focus my attack there, you know. So it's really important, I think, to make that distinction. So, for example, you might be to stay with the introvert idea, and you might be an introvert, and you say, well, that's just the way I am. True. So again, make sure you have space in your life where things are quiet, so that's because that's how you rest and recuperate. But it doesn't mean that you can't be friendly. Friendliness is a virtue that anyone can acquire. And introverted versus extroverted people may express friendship in different ways, but the habit of being friendly to others is something that anyone can acquire. So you wouldn't say, well, I'm an introvert, so friendship is not my strength. My strength is orderliness. And so I'm going to play to my orderliness
Yeah.
and someone else
Yeah.
can make like no one can make friends for you. You know, it's like you can't delegate parts of your character, you know?
Wow, that's really, really important to think of it that way. Mixing up personality or temperaments with character, that's very helpful. Yeah, because we do conflate those, I think, a lot.
You
Um,
shouldn't. The temperaments belong to personality, right? Virtues belong to character. So yeah.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, and you've done such a good job in here of again and again with this anatomy, embedding it in these stories. And one that particularly stood out for me, and I'll tell you why, especially today, is this about justice. And I don't even want to give it away because I was really impressed with the restraint you showed in writing your book because you kind of unspool some of these stories where it's like, whoa, oh, no way. It kind of, I didn't even realize I was getting good information that was helpful, but I didn't realize I was getting a story that was going to continue on to unfold the way it did in justice.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I'm just more in the dark than some people, but I had a real aha. And then even afterwards, there was another aha. And then this morning in confession, I went to confession this morning. In the confessional, when I'm thinking about this story about this particular person that you tell in the justice chapter, my confessor mentions the person as far as what I was struggling with that I'm talking to him. He says, "Well, even so and so, struggled, continued to struggle with justice even after he was aware of the injustice that he'd been a part of." And I couldn't believe it because it was very like this story that you had told was on my mind. And then in confession, this
Yeah,
name comes up. It's
that's
like,
great.
does everybody know about this person and his whole history and what he went on to do? And I don't. Maybe, but I don't think so. I think I'm fairly alert and yeah. Anyway, so that was a beautiful moment. Um, One other thing you were talking about was kind of just moving through the fog and not really being intentional about things. You talk not only about the taxonomy of the virtues, but kind of the progression through them, where you talk about unconscious incompetence, and then conscious incompetence, and then conscious, and then
Competent.
conscious competence, and then unconscious competence.
Right.
So this wonderful progression. And I think so many of us, like I was, I guess, maybe I'm just trying to let myself off the hook too easy. The unconscious incompetence I had toward a virtuous life for so much of my life, and then that first step into consciousness, but realizing, wow, your incompetence, and maybe a lot of people are there also, and just don't really know where to turn because we're not being taught that. So, if you would you mind just quickly talking about that progression all the way up to this highest ideal of unconscious competence in the virtues?
Yes, and the reason I chose that framework, it maps to the traditional framework for talking about the four stages of growth from vice to virtue, because you don't jump from vice, which is a bad habit, to virtue, which is a good habit. There are two intermediate stages. But like so much else with virtue, as I've had occasion to mention several times today, the words have lost their meaning or have shifted in meaning. So the words for the two intermediate stages are incontinence and continence, right? Which means something very different now. So I couldn't work with those. But this framework from unconscious incompetence through those two steps to unconscious competence maps perfectly, and it's kind of exactly what, or very closely exactly to what you're doing with virtue. And what it does is those two middle steps. So you go from unconscious incompetence, means you are unaware that you don't have this virtue. So, for example, if the virtue were honesty, you lie all the time and you don't even think of it. You just think that's just smart thinking. I just get what I want to get, so I'm just
Mm.
going to tell people what they need to hear, and that's the way my life works. And then one day, somehow, either you get caught in a trap of your own making because of your own lies, or you realize that people who lie a lot tend to die sooner, because it's just not healthy for your brain. It causes a lot more cognitive overload because it's like, what did I say to this one? And that you have to remember all the lies you told. Or you just somehow you realize that people who are honest, just like people who have every other virtue, are happier and healthier. And you go, okay, I want to be like that. And so then you start to try to tell the truth. And so now you move from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. Because what you find is, gosh, it's really hard because I have a habit of lying. So even though I intend to tell the truth, I tend to still lie a lot, and you struggle. And it's a struggle, and more often than not, you fail than you succeed. So that's the second level, right? The conscious incompetence. But if you keep at it and you keep practicing telling the truth, and in the book you may remember one of the suggestions I make, and this is I've seen this in research, is one of the easiest place to start is to say I don't know when you don't know.
Yeah,
For people who play fast and loose with the truth, they often make up stuff just because they don't want to say I don't know, you
yeah,
know. So, but merely just learning to go, I say I don't know. You realize, okay, that the world, the earth didn't open up and swallow me. I got away with that. I'm fine. So you practice and then you start just practicing telling the truth. So eventually you get to conscious competence, which is it's still a struggle,
Mm.
but now more often than not, you're telling the truth. Um, and most people think that you're going to stop there. And they look at the
Mm.
life of virtue and go, that sounds exhausting, sad. And like it was easier when I was lying all the time,
Didn't have to think about it. It just came naturally.
Yeah, but at the top of the hill is the unconscious competence, and that's true virtue. When you're in the conscious competence, you're still not a virtuous person. You're acting virtuously, but
Mm.
virtue hasn't
Mm.
that virtue
You're
honestly has not
faking it till you make it.
pretty much, and so it's hard work. But eventually, you'll get to the point if you keep persevering where you will tell the truth without even thinking about it, and it won't cost you any effort anymore.
Yeah.
Which, so this is what I say to our students is it feels like a struggle, but at the end of the struggle, what you're going to find is a habit. So something
Yeah.
that's going to make you happier, healthier, it's going to be more effective, and it's going to be easier, and it's just going to be part of you. I was giving a lecture on this at a university in Michigan last month. And during the question period, one of the deans asked me, he said, well, is it like there's 50 of these? Like, isn't your life going to get full up at a certain point where you just like, how many more practices, how many more habits can you add? And the answer is no, because as they become virtues, they literally become part of you. We say second nature. So you no longer have to give any thought to them or any time. They
Right.
just happen. It's not like, oh, my memory is full up because I filled it up with the virtue of honesty. It's like, no, it's part of you now, you
Yeah.
know? So yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have a wood shop. My casket making shop is just on the other side of this wall here. And, I struggled with woodworking for years and I still sometimes make mistakes and things. But yes, just now that I've habituated ways of doing things and yeah, that I don't really have to think about it. I can be contemplating other things or having conversations or whereas before if I wasn't focusing, I, I
Cut
might
off a
do something
finger,
like
right?
that.
Is that true?
Yeah, I did
Did
that
lose a finger.
7 years ago. I was actually listening to Crime and Punishment on my iPod, which I should not have been doing while I was working with my table saw. So yes, that can happen. So yeah.
Wow.
Um,
I was about to
Sorry, that was
joke.
a little
You did
startling.
lose a finger. Sorry, I didn't realize you actually did.
No,
Yikes. Okay.
well, it's not a joke, but at the same time, there is levity in everything. Well, there is a little bit. So you don't feel like it's too traumatic for me. I made these, which is I call it the power tool safety turkey. It's a outline of my hand, and he's saying, "Don't get gobbled." So,
Oh, nice.
yeah,
Very good.
so
I like it.
something came out of it. There's some
Yeah.
creativity that came out of it. Okay, well, thank you so much. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to say that I think what you've done here, I don't anything I can do to spread this far and wide is just we're so we're so looking in all the wrong places for the happiness that God has actually just kind of made us for. We've become so distracted and so attracted to things that are vicious and bad for us. You talked about and so for me as building coffins and then seeing tragic ends or lives that are less than what they were created to be. I want to encourage anyone who's listening to this to practice the virtues and to be willing to make those active choices to do better because all of this ultimately, you talk about Captain Sullenberger with practical wisdom, right? When he's all that he did. So there's this wonderful chapter and all that he did to be prepared for when this unlikely situation unfolded where his engines were destroyed by a flock of birds and he had to land and he landed on the Hudson. So he was recognizing his responsibility as an airline captain. He took it very seriously for years and decades so that when something like this happened, which probably wouldn't happen, but did happen, he was actually prepared and he was able to land that plane and save those lives. I just like to encourage everyone to think of our lives in a similar way where, you know, he was prepared for an extraordinary event because of the way he lived his life that was unlikely to happen. But we all are going to experience an extraordinary event. It is going to happen. It's not a question. And that's going to be when our earthly pilgrimage comes to an end And, for lack of a better way of putting it, our engines fail. There's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah.
And we're already pointed in the right direction. Our minds are already, conformed to this. Our life has been a practice. In some ways, we've built the foundations for eternity because I think that the virtues are what endure, like all the stuff that distracts us and everything. That's all going to be stripped away. But like this is a foundation for eternity. So in some ways, we even enter into eternity by living virtuous lives now. And I think that from what I've witnessed for 15 years of coffin making is instead of the end of our lives being, a terror or something that is terribly jarring, uh, it is a doorway to union with God. And so when that happens, as it will to all of us, when we're completely powerless on our own, if we're pointed in the right direction, maybe thanks to this book, Super Habits, we will also, like Captain Sullenberger, we'll be able to make that perfect, gentle landing into the arms of our Heavenly Father. So thank you, Dr. Abela.
My pleasure.
So let every mind